Welcome to Castle of Paint. My name is Ian and today we'll be painting a collector. This guy is all about collecting lightsabers from his fallen foes. Of course, I mean the droid commander himself, General Grievous. When Star Wars Shatterpoint came out, the Appetite for Destruction expansion pack was one of the first ones, and this superb miniature of Grievous was such a big sell for me about getting into this game. It's probably one of the best miniatures in the range, and I've been itching to paint him. So much so, I put it off a bit, because I wanted to do the sculpt justice. However, now it's time. Let's throw some paint onto the mini and see where we end up. I'll be doing this paint job in a few sections, all about the base, the body, the cloak, the weapons, and maybe some glowy bits. I start with the basics. Sandy bits get based with a mix of Citadel Baylor Brown and Vallejo Model Color Red Leather. The rest is base coated with Vallejo Model Color Dark Blue Grey. Now I want to add depth and bring out the highlights. I do this by taking the base tone and adding a highlight color to the mix. To start with, I'm going to be doing some basic layering. For the sand, I mix in some Citadel Screaming Skull and slowly make my way going ever brighter and brighter. After a few layers of this, I realize I'm not using my painting handle. What barbarism! At some point, I also realize I've forgotten my shadows, so I mix Vallejo Model Color Red Leather with some dark blue grey, add a lot of water to the mix, and then glaze in some shadows. I then return to adding more highlights, mixing more Screaming Skull in, and then stippling it onto the areas where light would hit. I know I said I wouldn't mess with light too much here, but I want the sand shadows to be darker in some points, so I do some more glazing around the back of the miniature and underneath any bits where the statue will cause a shadow. Now let's paint this poor fallen statue. I want to give it a weathered and beaten look, but not just stick to the greys and greys of rock. Rock is multicolored and beautiful. My wife is a geologist and she told me to say this. As opposed to going grey, I took some Citadel Baneblade Brown and mixed it with my base dark blue grey. I then paint this on all the areas not covered in shadow from our cyborg boy. The recesses here are very shallow, so it's a struggle to know the precise place to add this layer. I make irregular strokes, trying to keep this natural, almost trying to sculpt with the paint. I do the same with two other colours. Vallejo Model Color Red Leather mixed with the dark blue grey. Then the same grey mixed with Vallejo Model Color Olive Green. After the olive green layer, I throw in some Vallejo Model Color Medium Sea Grey to the mix, do some more layers, and finally for the highlights, do some dots with pure Medium Sea Grey. To the back of this mini under his cloak, which would be in shadow, I add some Vallejo Model Color Black to the dark blue grey and paint this into the deeper recesses. This looks a bit stark, so I clean it up off camera with a mix closer to the blue grey. With the base looking great, I move on to the robot dude himself. In the films he's metallic, being a cyborg, and so I take Vallejo Metal Color exhaust manifold and paint it over his metal skeleton. This includes his neck and the metal parts on the side of his torso. I then paint on a base layer for his armor panels. These are kinda tan brown bone kinda color, so I paint on Citadel Baneblade Brown. I will use this as my midtone, going higher and lower in the value next. In order to do this, I want to glaze on the shadows. Going very gradually, so I decide to use a wash. It's pre-thinned and so will be good for glazing. I take the wash, mix the teeniest tiny bit of water, put it on my brush, wipe off the brush on a damp bit of paper towel, and now prepared, I paint in the shadows. I'm trying to angle the brush so that the most paint comes off in the parts I want to be darker. As this is a glaze, it's going to take a lot of coats. I refer back to these quick snaps I took to know where the darker parts will be, using the sprayed white highlight from the beginning to decide on which is light and what is dark. While I paint these extra coats on, let's hear a word about this mysterious warrior. Grievous, born Quienjalshalia, maybe, was a Kalish male warlord who served within the military forces of the Confederacy of Independent Systems as a commanding officer during the Clone Wars in the final years of the Republic era. In addition to his position as a general within the Separatist Droid Army, the Kalish held the title of Supreme Marshal Commander of the Separatist Droid Armies throughout the duration of the war, in which he led countless engagements against the Republic's Grand Army. Recognized for his ruthless tactics and extensive cybernetic enhancements, Grievous utilized the Separatist Droid Army and his adept combat skills to instill fear throughout the galaxy as he traveled to and invaded planets, while also engaging numerous Knights of the Jedi Order, his sworn enemies. Okay, Once these shadows are in, I then want to go bright. I think this glazing worked well, so I want to try and do similar with the highlights. However, my colour of choice here is on the wash, and so I take Citadel Screaming Skull, mix in my base Bane Belly Brown, add in some glazed medium from Vallejo, and start the same process with my brush going the other way. Each layer needs to be dry before I go again, otherwise I might pull the paint off or overload the layer when I don't want to. When I think we are starting to reach a good blend, I add in more Screaming Skull to the mix and go back to glazing, this time covering even less. Now it's time for the armour to be completed. I take pure Screaming Skull and edge highlight everything. On the flat surfaces I do small dots, just like was done on the base. Then I take some Screaming Skull, mix in some white grey. This is super bright and so should only be used on the very edges. Too much of this will be overpowering. Then the very final bit of the armour is pure white grey dots on the very edges. It's metal time. Again, I want to bring down this tone a bit. To do this, I take the same wash and glaze it over the areas where little light would not hit. For my first highlight, I take some Vallejo metal colour Duralinium and add it into the base exhaust manifold. Then I paint an edge highlight over the areas that will be hit by the light. Then I do a final edge highlight with pure aluminium on the very edges. Very. Now it's time for Grievous's lovely flowing cape. If we hop back to the reference images, we can see it's grey on the top and this nice pricey looking red inside. Very fancy. I base the red with Vallejo Game Colour Gory Red and the grey with Vallejo Model Colour Dark Blue Grey. To do the grey, I first want to paint in my shadow tones. Using the pictures taken before, I take a mix of the paint I used before, Vallejo Model Colour Blue Grey, and some Vallejo Model Colour Black. Then I layer this into the cuts into the cloak, the little holes in any place the cloak drops. All the recesses. I do this messy, and so clean up by making a glaze of the previous paint and try to feather them in together. This was semi-successful. Time for highlights. To start with, I do things basic. I add a tiny bit of Vallejo Model Medium Sea Grey and the dark blue grey, and layer on over the bits of the cloak where the light would hit. Then I add a bit more and do another layer. Now it's time to test my brush control. Since the top of the cape is devoid of much texture, I'm going to try and add it. For the first two layers, I take my same mixture as before and start to paint in lines over the brighter areas. Both horizontal and vertical lines as thin as possible. After 2 goes with the previous mix, I then switch to Vallejo Model Colour Neutral Grey and do the same process. Then I add in some medium sea grey to that and keep on going. Here I'm trying to only do the texture on the areas of the cloak that will be hit by the light, and as I go higher in the value of the paint, I tend to add less and do it on fewer sections. I'm using my best brush for these steps, my Raphael 8404, and battered though it is, I can do very thin lines. The lines need to not be too far apart, and as thin as possible, otherwise he might look like a lumberjack. With the top of the cloak looking good, I move on to the bottom. The top of the cloak has only a small bit of texture, but the bottom has loads. Because of that, I'm going to throw a wash over it. I mix a bit of water with Citadel Agrax Earthshade and apply it to the whole of the undercloak. Next step is to brighten up the colour again. So I take the base gory red and paint it over, trying to follow the texture of the cloak and trying to consider which bits would be hit by the light that went through his arms and legs. Once this is done, I then take some clear orange and add it to the red. Then I get adding tiny dots onto tiny sculpted diamonds. Maybe squares, maybe? I then keep going. While I do that with progressively more and more orange, let's hear more about the good General. A native of Kali, a planet within the wild space, Sheila grew to become a fearsome warrior of his people and gained an aptitude for warfare and battle tactics when he led his people during the Kalish War against their technologically advanced enemies, the Yamri. Invading from the planet Hook, Kwamian Jal Shilal eventually took the name Grievous, easier to pronounce, and continued his conquest, quickly becoming a warlord, earning a bloody reputation on his homeworld. Gathered together, Grievous travelled and fought alongside a group of personal bodyguards, the Izvoshra. It's almost like they don't want me to be able to pronounce anything. Grievous's potential was seen by the Sith lords Darth Sidious and Darth Tyrannus, also known as Dooku, the Count of Serrano, as he led his people in a merciless war against the Yamri, brutally pushing the insect species from his world. However, the Galactic Republic and Jedi Order intervened in the conflict on the side of the Yamri, leading to punishment and famine for the Kalish and generating in Grievous an enduring grudge. The Sith, who had significant plans for Grievous, offered Grievous cybernetic enhancements, which the Kalish accepted and took on over time. Sometime later, Dooku conspired to mortally wound Grievous and sabotage his shuttle, which resulted in a gruesome crash that left the man on the brink of death. After that, Grievous gave up almost everything that remained of his organic form, whether it had been lost in the crash or by his own decision-making, to survive. Now let's paint some weapons. To start on his lightsabers, obtained only in completely F-cool ways, of course, I used Vallejo metal color gunmetal grey. It's at this point that I realised I should use this on my base for the metallics on Grievous, and not exhaust manifold. This is much darker and matches his look a bit more. We live and learn. With one coat done to the saber hilts, I then paint on some Vallejo metal color duralinium. This I just do to the tops of the weapon hilts, trying to pick out any of the small details I can. Then I do a final super sparing spot highlight with Vallejo model color aluminium. Now, we're super close to finishing, so let's do some final details. A quick and also interesting one is to cover the base in Vallejo burnt sienna pigment powder, really working it in where the grey meets the sandy to try and blend it a bit. We'll seal this layer with some varnish. For now, let's read some more lore! The reconstructed Grievous became a skilled lightsaber duelist under Count Dooku's guidance, who trained the Kalish in the arts of lightsaber combat and eventually welcomed him into a position as a warrior in the Confederacy. He was one of the most powerful people within the Separatist Alliance, second only to his master Dooku. Grievous wielded his skills as a brilliant military strategist and melee combatant during numerous campaigns against the Republic throughout the Clone Wars, while also gaining a reputation for hunting and killing Jedi Knights. He made a habit of claiming their lightsabers as trophies and weapons to be used against other opponents. His position and threat level led to his preeminence as one of the Republic's primary targets throughout the course of the war. Now I think I want to do his eyes. The eyes of Grievous are one of the few bits of his original organic form he kept. They're baleful and yellow and surrounded by his damaged flesh. To try and get dark eye sockets before I add the white, and then yellow, I put my Agrax Earthshade to work and add it into the recesses. Once that is dry, I paint white onto the eyes using Vallejo model color white grey. Then I take Vallejo gaming color sun yellow and try to paint his iris. Finally, and as always with eyes, a prayer on my lips, I try to do the black dot of his pupil, more aligned in this case to match his eyes. Off camera, I clean up the skin with Baneblade Brown and the armor with Screaming Skull. He gets a black base rim and airbrush layer of matte varnish, and it's time to show him off to his waiting troops of the Separatist droid army. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this cyborg being pieced together. Stay tuned for more, and to delve deeper into what we're doing, head over to castlepaint.com.